This video will be the introductory video to a short series that will be dealing with the subject of racism, and more specifically whether or not racism is inherited, taught, or both, and it will be dealing with how mutable racism is as well. I will not primarily argue my point using logic and rationality, like most anti-some white nationalists are doing on the internets. Instead, I will primarily be providing you evidence, scientific evidence, from various sources that complements my position on the matter, and so that you can draw your own conclusion from the scientific studies and data. Anti-racists want to claim that anti-racism is the natural default position, while racists want to claim that racism is the natural default position. This because if their view is the natural, inherited, and default position, then they're not the ones who has been brainwashed or something along those lines. That is at least the idea behind this peon's comments here, and also the idea behind my video series on the subject. We've all heard comments like your parents taught you to be racist, racism is taught, racism is a nasty idea, and so on. I'm sure everyone has seen these comments at least once in their lifetime. Some say that it is an idea started a long time ago, possibly in ancient China, if the not-so-great Alexander the Great is correct. Otherwise, it's possibly that it began in Egypt, among other places, if we are to trust the book Race, The Reality of Human Differences by Vincent Sarich and Miel, who provides us with anthropological evidence of the practice of racism around the world through the last 3,000 to 5,000 years. They originally made the book in a response to an anti-white documentary which had as its premise that racism is a white man's idea, started in the 18th century to justify slavery. An obviously historically incorrect premise, so let's instead look at whether it is an idea still practiced and taught today by the dying older whites, and unfortunately by some of their less progressive and less aware descendants, or whether it is a natural inherited trait practiced by all species to further divergence and thus evolution. I want to keep this short and sweet, so let's cut to the chase. I am of the belief that racism isn't just an idea, nor that it is primarily an idea, like some people do. I am instead of the belief that racism primarily is a natural phenomenon, and that anti-racism is a unnatural phenomenon, and that if anything could be called an idea, and if anything were to be taught, it would be anti-racism and not racism. So let me first attempt to define what I mean by natural. By natural I mean genetic, biological, freely emerging without outside interference. And by idea I mean something that does not supersede or come beforehand a biological trait. As an example, it might be natural to want to have sex. The urge, the drive, is biological, genetic. If there were no taboos to practice sex freely, many might do it. Whilst asexuality also can be natural, in the sense that some actually do lack the genetic and biological essential necessities to experience a sexual drive, most people do not lack it, however. And because most people do not lack the biological necessities for a sexual drive, what ensured that most people aren't promiscuous is an idea, a culture, an exterior force that opposes an interior force. It is in this sense that I, unlike some others, consider racism to be an interior force, a natural inherited phenomenon, and anti-racism an exterior force, a developed idea. It is instead anti-racism that is taught. Before I go on any further to prove my point, I would like to ensure the viewer that I am well aware of the naturalistic fallacy, that just because something is natural does not mean it is good. I am not making the naturalistic fallacy by proving my point that racism is natural, because until I actually explicitly in these videos make the claim that racism is natural and natural means good, I have not committed it. However, and this is as secular to whether my premise is correct or not, I might possibly argue that since racism is natural, what is natural is not always particularly mutable, and since it isn't particularly mutable, it is not practical to base a society and a civilization on false ideas. This is not a naturalistic fallacy, and this is an entirely different debate from whether racism is primarily natural and anti-racism is taught, and anti-racism is natural and racism is taught.
Well, I don't think that Canadians have somehow managed to suspend the laws of human nature. Human nature is the same everywhere. People are tribal. We can like it, we can not like it. But I believe that a society should be built on an assumption of reality, on an acceptance of the facts as they are, rather than as Professor March might wish they could be. It is folly to build a nation on the assumption that race can be made not to matter. No nation has achieved this. All the nations that are attempting it are failing.
In this video, I will not begin arguing my point by providing the scientific evidence. I will instead in this video briefly introduce you to the people and the view I disagree with. I will begin with introducing to you some comments by people who are of the opposite opinion of me, and if you pause the video and read the comments, I want you to think of the three-part video series I just did in the alleged generational gap in ethnocentrism or ethnoconsciousness. Notice how these comments passing by implicitly attacks the older generations. Notice how the commentators are self-segregating from their relatives and ancestors and make the inherited in-group the problem, how they contrast themselves against their relatives and not against what would inherently be the out-group. I'd also like to point out that they're contradicting themselves. Racism is usually explicitly thought of as making prejudgments, something they implicitly think is bad. However, they never define racism and makes all sorts of wild generalizations and assumptions themselves, assuming a person who could be identified as a racist, say a separatist, does it out of anger, hate, or desire of violence, and not based on narcissism, love, and ideas of what is most pragmatic. I think the way they choose to make a word simplistic, marginalize it, and pathologize their opposition says more about them than any possible racist, due to their contradiction. Also, I'd like to point out that I don't like these pathological terms, and the reason for it is not because I fear what is being associated with me. I have no problems with what is being associated with me, not because I consent to what is being associated to me, everything from nooses to burning crosses, but I have no problem with it due to the reason that my political opponent's interest is usually not to believe me or honestly discuss issues in the first place, and as such it doesn't matter what I will say, because they are in all likelihood not interested in honestly, genuinely hearing me out, and only interested in shutting down a possible debate due to whatever reason, insecurity perhaps. Now, the reason I don't like these pathological terms is because they are implicit red herrings, meant to make you forget the debate and instead focusing on arguing about your innocence so that they want to stick around and debate you. It's quite ridiculous that the people who walk around and call you ignorant are the same people that attempts to make you justify why you ought to be given the chance to debate them in the first place. And then when you argue about your innocence so that you can debate them, they are doing their utmost to prove why you are wicked and ought to be ignored anyway. I'm sorry, I cannot respect such persons, and I believe my justification for it is based on the personal characteristics and qualities of my opponent, unlike my political opponent who attacks me for not basing my personal opinions of individuals based on personal characteristics and qualities, when he does this very same thing himself, as he attempts to associate me with others and attempts to ignore hearing me personally out. Now, my reason for making generalization comes from the logical fact that you cannot have a first-hand experience of each and every individual, whilst my political opponent actually has the opportunity to have a first-hand experience with me, if only he would stop with the pathological labels and actually discuss or engage in a debate. Okay, so there are essentially three categories of people when it comes to my opposition in these matters. 1. Those who believe all of us are blank slates, and that there is no biological predisposition to racism or anti-racism, and that we likewise have no other biological predisposition towards behavioral phenomena such as alcoholism, for an example. Those who believe all of us are blank slates, and that this means we're anti-racists, as anti-racism to them is a default position. And 3. Those who believe racism is both genetic and environmental, in that we might have genetic predisposition towards behaviors that leads to racism, but that environment can influence how much these inherited traits will ensure racism actually manifests. They also believe our inclinations are highly mutable, and thus environment plays a larger role. Now, for group 1, I would recommend them to purchase the book The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker. Read it. Love it. And for number 2, I would recommend them to read the book Race, The Reality of Human Differences by Vincent Sarish and Miel. They will provide you anthropological evidence from different areas of the world where racism has been practiced, and it seems to be a default position, but otherwise stick around for this video series and I will provide you enough scientific evidence to perhaps convert you. We will see. Number 3, however, I kinda agree with, but I disagree with them on mutability. A way in which I'm going to ignore to argue with rationality is that I could potentially make arguments against position 2, telling those of that position that if anti-racism indeed is a default position, then why do we all need hate crime laws, free speech restriction, champions of diversity, diversity courses, classes, books on how to raise your child in a multicultural environment, kindergarten projects, office politics, and so forth? And why are people self-segregating in schools and in the cities despite these courses, classes, festivals, books, as can be observed in the documentary Immigration: The Inconvenient Truth, and in demographic maps over American cities, and in articles in Sweden and France? I would probably point them to this debate between Peter March and Jared Taylor and ask them, when they've seen the whole debate, how, with as much problems with diversity as Jared Taylor had compiled and introduced to us, they honestly can assume anti-racism is the easy default position we all will regress back towards once racism has stopped oppressing our previously shackled minds. Because I frankly don't see it. And I think Peter March is correct when he says,
well, I think the fact is, I've learned a lot from the fact is that the kind of data that's running around in the media, and indeed the kind of data you get off a lot of the human rights commissions, etc., speaks very, very strongly in favor of racism. And I now understand why many of my university wanted me to shut up about this, because they suspect, of course, that if you have an open discussion, the racist is going to win.
I think number 3 is closer to the truth in that our behavior usually is a combination of both nature and nurture. However, where I disagree is in how mutable some of our behaviors are, and one of these behavioral examples, level of mutability, that I disagree with is that which we call racism. Some final words. I have chosen to include racial prejudice, racial stereotyping, racial grouping, and collectivizing, racial ethnocentrism, racial phenotypical preference in the concept and word of racism. And I am not talking about a desire to practice violence or mistreat for the sake of mistreating. If any mistreating is taking place, it's usually as a response to an earlier mistreatment or a mean to an end. That in this case can be the desire of representative power to gain Lebensraum necessary for the survival of any species, which includes subspecial groups such as race. Okay, so with that said, this was the introductory video to this series, and again, I will argue at one point in the video series against a female and her conclusion. I think she draws a incorrect conclusion from the study she made, and that will probably be one of the few times that I actually will use logic and rationality against her, against the opposition. Otherwise I will mainly just introduce you to these scientific findings. Alright, so I hope you will enjoy this series once it's done, and that it's a subject that you'll find interesting.